I have a variety of emotions. Um, Thankful to still be alive and with enough clarity to tell this story because it needs to be told. And then apprehensive because I see our entire country going toward a place that reminds me of 1979. And I have children and grandchildren, so I fear that.
Well, I share the feelings that Joyce had just shared, but I often wonder what might have been different if Greensboro had been able and had the courage and the commitment to face the truth of what really happened instead of creating a false narrative that actually took root and grew here. And I think it contributed to a trend that has now swept across, or is sweeping across the nation. And I say that with the full understanding that there are things that I wish that I had done different or we had done differently. But it was clear once we looked at the files of the police that this was not a shootout. It was not just some people running down out of the hills and killing us. It was a North American death squad facilitated by the Greensboro police with the knowledge of the FBI and the BATF. That's what we know now. And Greensboro is still in deep denial about this. And we've been demonized for 40 years, at least I have, and by implication those who are associated with me. There is some sense of relief because a greater portion of the community is coming to realize that their understanding of what happened is really not accurate. And we're still here. Our testimony is the last 40 years. If we were the monsters that we were projected to be, it didn't show up after that, except we have always challenged the position of the city, and we always will until we die, because it's not true. And it's a disservice to the community to have that narrative out there when it could have put out a different narrative that would address white supremacy and some of the other maladies that underlie what happened here.
So let's get the real story on the record. Let's go back to that day. Tell me what you remember.
Well, that day is a piece of the story. And on that day, arrangements had been made to meet with Lieutenant Trevor Hampton of the police department. He was a black man. I actually knew him, know his family, and have continued to be friends with his family. He never showed up. In fact, no police officer showed up until after the carnage by the Klan and Nazis. The story that was put out is that they were confused about where the starting point of the march was. Even though there was only one designated starting point, it was never changed. And two new officers were assigned to replace Trevor Hampton. When the Klan came in, there was a chant, "Death to the Klan." I think that was unfortunate, but freedom of speech has no meaning if you're going to get killed for it. So that was exercising that piece. And then a shot was fired out of the lead vehicle. I was looking straight at it. A young man in that vehicle with Eddie Dawson. And the people ran away from, he fired it in the air at about a 45-degree angle, so he wasn't aiming at anybody. But the people ran in the opposite direction. Well, they were running in the direction of the 9th car in that caravan that opened the trunk of their cars, pulled out long weapons, and fired on the group. Jim Waller, the president of the union at Haw River, was shot in the back. Bill Sampson, a lead organizer at the largest denim producing factory in the world, White Oak, was shot through the heart. Cesar Corsey, who was an organizer of non-academic workers at Duke and chicken workers in other factories, was shot through the heart and killed. Sandy Smith, who had just moved to Kannapolis and was going to be organizing at Cannon Mills, was shot between the eyes. She was the former student government president at Bennett College and was a sister to Joyce and I. And Dr. Michael Nathan, who was there to assist the elderly because the march was going to be about 3 miles. He was shot flush in the face. I think he was trying to get to some people who were wounded when he himself was shot. And as I said, because I negotiated the parade permit, because I knew the matter of saying we couldn't be armed, and because I could see Captain Gibson sitting across the table from me saying, if you want this parade permit, then you have to sign. I did sign, and I did not know what I came to know, largely as a result of the discovery in the third trial, where there was simply a treasure trove of material that indicated that the BATF knew, the FBI knew, and the Greensboro police knew and were active in facilitating it. That's actually a very brief account of it. When we had the truth process, I laid out in some detail my regrets and my criticism. I regretted calling the mayor on that day a dog, but he had named me as the most dangerous person in Greensboro, which put a target on my back. Jim Melvin was the mayor at the time, and I regretted calling the Klan out of their name. That diminished the humanity of a person. In fact, it diminishes your own humanity when you do that. Those things I pondered and thought about, and I wrote them up, and they're on page 20 in my document. I've never heard any public reference to them through the newspaper or any other source. We were simply presented as monsters. And I'm sad that the city doesn't take the responsibility for apologizing for what the police force did on that day and did not do. And I'm asking them once again to do that for their own health, for the health of the city, and it would be helpful to us as well.
And part of what I recall about that day certainly includes what Nelson just shared, but it harkens back to before that day. We were very dedicated young people who were organizers in the textile mills, organizers in the community, and for probably more than we realized were successful at it. So we had actively, in 1979, I don't know how old you are, probably pretty young, but at that time had brought together in a southern city that's in a right-to-work state, black and white workers, a few Latinos, as was Cesar Corsey, together to struggle for their own democratic and economic rights. And we were very successful with that. And that is why I think, in fact, I'm clear why our friends were killed, why we have been targeted over the years, because we were building up those trade unions in a way that they had never been. We had elderly, they probably were the age that I am now, elderly white union members who started seeing that they had unity with black workers, with workers around the world. They became active, some of them in our African liberation support, because there was just that level of affinity of, we really want human rights for everybody. And that was seen as a threat to those who were the owners of those mills. because they were concerned about people pushing for, I don't think we even used the word living wage at that point, but just a fair wage. It was about $3 and some cents an hour. There were safety concerns. Women face sexual harassment. That's a lot of what my dear friend Sandy Smith worked on. So what I have, and I hold on to that, is some very committed people who were effectively organizing in the community around housing, around education, recreation for children, and that type of thing, and also for their economic sustenance in those mills, which is where a large number of people in Greensboro worked at that time.
What was the goal of the rally that day?
The goal of the rally really was a build-up to a conference, an educational conference that was to be held over on East Florida Street. Some people would recall it as the old Cosmos #2 area. And we were having people come from around the state and some from nearby places in Virginia to discuss the potential of organizing among workers and community organizers, and also the dilemma we were facing of increased activity by the Klan, like we're seeing now, which sought to divide workers. So we had a situation where workers were seeing their unity of purpose, of need, and then there was this force saying that no, white workers don't get with black workers, they're taking your jobs. Just like we hear now, American workers, we need to cage immigrant workers, they're taking your jobs. So it's the same kind of song with just another verse to it. But the goal was to educate, self-educate among ourselves, and really build greater solidarity to build a better quality of life for all of us, which would have meant for everybody in the city, whether you worked in a mill or not.
Where were you when you heard the first gunshot?
I was actually at a location a few blocks away, Windsor Community Center, and I did not hear the shots. I was there to just help direct people who were coming from some of these other places I mentioned off of Lee Street. And what I remember is a lot of police cars running back and forth, and then someone ran over and said, the Klan showed. It was like, what? You know, and some people were shot, maybe killed. I can't even fully remember how I got over. I remember just running, you know, I was about 32 then, running over to that area and saw just complete confusion, disruption, worried about everybody, but certainly worried about my husband, our 2 children who were 7 and 8 years old at that time, and a whole community of people who would come out to be a part of this. Everything was just in a very disruptive kind of a situation.
What about you, sir? Do you remember that, hearing that first shot? See, you saw it, the 45-degree angle.
I saw the first shot that was not aimed at anybody. It was aimed in the air. And by the way, the officials, FBI and all of that, argued confusion about what was the first shot. And then in that is they were trying to say that we possibly fired the first shot. I saw the first shot. I knew what I was looking at. And I didn't hear any other shots until later. And when I say later, it's hard to compute the time because I was under assault by a man a Nazi who tried to stab me. He had a butcher knife and he was coming up on my midsection. I blocked it with my arm. The knife went through my arms. I can't raise this finger now any further than that because the muscle is cut off. So somebody threw me a stick, which was a stick that we put posters on. I was using that stick to ward off the attack by the knife guy. And it looked like he intended to kill me in the most gruesome way. That's when I first recall hearing another shot that was coming from the opposite direction. And actually, when that shot was fired, the people who had dismounted their vehicles seemed to get right back in and just disappeared. When I say disappeared, they were no longer on the street fighting us. They were back in their cars in the process of leaving. As the shots were being fired, I ran across the street because I was no longer engaged with this Nazi, and to see where the shots were coming from. I never did get a clear view of where they were coming from until it was over. So that was my encounter. I was engaged in a knife engagement, and I was near Sally Bermanson, and I was near Frankie Penn, whose picture's over there. I saw her bleeding in the face. She had been shot with apparently a shotgun, buckshots. She was pregnant. She survived. Her son is born, doing well as far as I know, and I'm looking forward to see her. And many of the other people on November 3rd. For many people, it'll be the first time they're coming back to Greensboro. And I had hoped that Greensboro would welcome them back and apologize for what the police did with the support of the city council. I sent a letter recently to reiterate that. I sent one in 2 years ago, right after Charlottesville. And I sent another one more recently. And I'm still encouraging them to apologize. And I want to ask the community to join me in asking them to apologize.
Did anyone from your group fire back?
Yes. Let me share this with you. It's too much to put on camera, but I'll tell it. On the night before the march, we had a meeting, and I shared with the group that the police prohibited us from having any weapons, concealed or unconcealed. By the way, they saw the Klan conceal all of their weapons and drive 4 or 5 miles across town and never stopped them, and never told us. But I argued that the Klan had no history. I had no idea that they were planning to come, but I said to people who said that this is dangerous, I said, well, it looks dangerous, but I don't have any knowledge of the Klan riding into a black community where hundreds of black people live in the middle of the day with the police there and starting something. Especially, we have a reputation of being militant. They don't know whether we're armed or not. So I argued that that this prohibition was probably set up to get us to violate it, you know, and then we would be arrested by the police. And so we compromised that 3 people had weapons, but they were not of any magnitude. And they were going to ride ahead on the bicycle and make sure that people weren't up on bridges and places. None of that ever happened. So a couple of shots were fired back. But one lady had a pistol with 2 barrels on it, looked like out of the 1800s, with only 2 shots. We had no idea that this kind of assault would happen. I was compromising more to satisfy those who felt endangered. We were in no way prepared for the kind of onslaught, the murderous onslaught that befell us. And then this whole thing got reframed as a shootout. It's like a cannon is being fired at you, and you have 1 or 2 22-shot things. So I don't deny that shot was fired from us, but it had no real effect. And
it was not initiated.
It was not initiated.
It wasn't a shootout.
It was a desperate attempt to try to defend yourself when you were effectively disarmed by the police. And Cooper, who was later convicted, or found liable for wrongful death, knew these people were, he took pictures of them loading them in their cars. And I'm ashamed of our leadership talking about white supremacy in your government. And then 25 years later, when South Africa joined us in helping to build a truth process, Archbishop Tutu came over here twice and worked with us, sent Bukani Finker, who was a part of the Truth Commission in South Africa. We went down to Peru and met with the International Meeting of Truth Commissions and got encouragement for them. And then the City Council of Greensboro voted to oppose the truth process. All 6 white people voted to oppose it. 3 black women voted to support it. And then they made the outrageous claim that it had nothing to do with race. Almost none of what I'm sharing with you now has been made public. So we have endured the burden of demonization. And it has affected our children. I had options to leave here, and I chose not to leave because I felt that it was important for me to stay in Greensboro, to carry on the work that we have been carrying on. And the best testimony for who we are is what we did for the last 40 years. We actually won against the largest retail store in the nation at that time, Kmart, the best first contract in the history of the state, and did it in a way that brought the city together. We marched to Raleigh and got released Kwame Cannon, the governor, who was Jim Hunt at the time, that I got to meet and talk to. The mayor of the city went down with us, Carolyn Allen, and we got that man released. He was given 2 consecutive life sentences as a 17-year-old child because his mother was a part of our organization. So we've carried on this work, and we're still carrying it on. Perhaps the greatest challenge that we've faced is we've not been able to get the city to take serious that the police department cannot be what it ought to be without some deep changes on the inside. Some cosmetic things have been done, we acknowledge those. But we put out a booklet, you see it over here, our democratic mission, that laid out a process. And the chief objectively spit on it, you know, and denounced it.
You mentioned this has had an impact on your children. Tell me about that. What has it done to them?
On the 25th anniversary, my youngest daughter just broke down and cried because they were 7 and 8 years old. They were taunted in school by other children who said, "Your daddy got people killed." My daughter says she only fought one time, and that was over that issue. There were janitors and maids at the school who knew us and knew this wasn't true. There was some comfort in them sharing with us that they would look after our children. But to see your father being wrestled to the ground and beaten by the police and jail, even though the charges were later dropped, affects a child. And I thank God that they have endured this and have matured into young ladies that I'm proud of. One of them is at North Carolina Central. She's an administrator there. And the other one is a nurse who's a nurse manager with one of the larger drugstores and I don't know, what do they call it?
I'm not sure, but what the other end of it has made them some of the more compassionate women that I know, and very effective in what they do, but very people-centered. But we,
Sounds like they take after you guys.
you know, children probably never like to admit that, but I suspect so. But but it's just that having to grow up through that. And so when I see, say, the young kids at the border, I think about it. When I see young people in other countries going through a lot of struggles, I think about not just our children, but other children who have had to endure things as their race, their particular parents or whatever are being targeted, you know, and it does impact folk. But the good thing is, as I said, we've just seen a lot of compassion and what have you out of them, as opposed to some of the negative things that often happen to young people, you know. So far so good, but you never know the impacts. There are some young people out of Morningside homes where this happened told us that after some of them had seen people shot down in the street, and they knew some of the people because we were very active in the community, that nobody showed up there that Monday morning, or certainly not that Sunday, to offer counseling or whatever. They just had to go to school, suck it up, you know, this just happened. So it wasn't just our friends who were killed, but a community was terrorized, and actually our whole city was under constant police surveillance. You know, you could hear helicopters up in the air and what have you. You know, going in and out of your home, you had to be worried about whether you would get shot. There were people who knew us and whom we had helped, had worked with around housing issues or around loss of job or whatever. They were frightened for a while, because these were folk who were doing good in the community, yet they've been killed. And what helped me to continue is just singing songs to myself. I still do that today.
What do you sing?
One song I sing a lot is "I Feel Like Going On, Though Trials Come."
Would you mind singing a little bit for me? Good to hear it.
I usually sing as I'm moved by the Spirit. I feel like going on. I feel like going on. Though trials come on every hand, I feel like going on. So of course that comes from my religious, spiritual background. One of the more precious times that I sang that song was when a mentor of ours, Dr. Vincent Harding, you might have heard his name. He was a spiritual confidant of Dr. King and helped mentor us as he was going into surgery, which he never fully recovered from. His wife called and asked me to sing that song to Vincent. So I feel connected across the ages of, we just keep moving. And that's part of what we hope that this 40th anniversary commemoration will do, is get the truth out there, but not just to feel vindicated or anything like that, but to encourage all types of folk to continue that quest for what we call the beloved community. That's what Dr. King called it. Others call it the kingdom of God, but a place where the dignity and the worth, the potential of everybody is appreciated and realized. So that's what spurs me on, and that's what I feel like going on to achieve.
What's the biggest thing you think has changed in 40 years?
The biggest thing that has changed is probably the expansion of the awareness by more people. I wish there were more folk that knew. There's a lot of information out there, you know, particularly with folk like you, with the broadcast media and all that, but there's more overall awareness and there's more connectedness across the waters. I feel as connected to people who are in foreign countries as I do with people here. So because it's about humanity ultimately. And then as we're facing these climate crises, which we are a part of making, just our future and what it looks like is increasingly a question. And I am so thankful to my brothers and sisters who are in this country Native Americans, but those folk who are indigenous people who are more close to those questions of the climate than we tend to be, for teaching me and others about the need to live in a correct relationship and harmony with Mother Earth, and that all of us have to do that. And so there's just more of an expansive awareness and connectedness, and as part of that expansive connectedness that I still have a sense of hope. When we're living in our little communities unconnected, we don't feel the need to stretch out and do something extra to make it better. But I think that potential's there.
What do you think has stayed the same that needs to change?
What is still the same is that some of that lack of connectedness is still there. We don't appreciate each other as ultimately brothers and sisters who've got to live how to learn how to work together. As my husband preaches, is we got to learn to walk together and not get weary in it. So we still have the systems, no matter what they're called, that are hierarchical. So there's a view that if you happen to be male, you happen to be white, you happen to be educated, you happen to be this or that you are intrinsically of greater worth than someone who is not that. I just don't believe it. That's one of the biggest lies that humankind's ever told. But yet we operate out of those lies. And so as those untruths get unpacked, and I think they are, through the connectedness, then there's the hope. But some of that's still there.
Do you think a shooting like this could happen today?
It is happening.
It has.
It's normalized now.
Yeah, it has.
And actually, I just want to lock into what she said. What has to change is the rise of white supremacy, which is undergirded by a money-making system.
That's true.
You know, I saw the debate on television a few nights ago, and it was one gentleman running for, I don't want to call anybody's name, for president, held up his hand and said, 3 people, the richest people in the nation, have more wealth than the lower 50% of the entire population. And you have to reason that he's not billion times smarter than everybody, didn't work a billion times harder than everybody, but there is a mechanism, a system, a process that facilitates that kind of unequal accumulation of wealth. And it's very evil, and it rides atop white supremacy. You know, that's, or it undergirds white supremacy. That's a better way to put it. And I think instead of white supremacy being reduced, it actually has made its way openly into the highest echelons of the nation. And it is ultimately rooted in a desire for that kind of wealth, which is the foundation of a certain modality of hierarchy, and fear, you know. And when you have that fear factor, I think it's driving the lower echelon of white people who think that the reason they don't have it is because of other people of color. And therefore, this kind of lunging out against people indiscriminately has become normative. When we think of the trial that took place around the massacre, there was no trial of what happened. There was a trial of an ideology. It was named communism. And in a sense, we many of us don't identify with that ideology anymore in its totality. But in some sense, to be able to dissect how the accumulation of capital works and how certain people are denied what they need to live on while others are wallowing in the obscenity of too much, that part of it is accurate. I struggle with the absence of a spiritual base to it. And in that sense, I think it loses its way. But it's the 4th chapter of the book of Acts in our Bible where the apostles were saying that we want to sell everything we have and give to each as each have need. That's not far from each according to his ability, to each according to their needs. So that kind of stuff has some relationship to Christendom, but this matter of believing that you don't have to dictate to people as a necessary part of transformation. We believe that transformation can occur by engaging the evils of society, but believing that every human being has the potential to change. And the more we grow that spirit, the more the possibility of change with minimal bloodshed can happen. The more we block that and we set up a fractured society like this, the more we invite the kind of conflict that we're seeing now. And white people cannot just run around and kill people and not expect that wind to create a whirlwind. And after a while, it's confusing about how all of this is happening. And I think that underneath it all is a false sense of self that's buttressed by the accumulation of massive wealth, and also builds a massive military to protect it all. So all of that needs to change. We believe it can change, but we think that it has to grow out of the base. That's why we have established as our mission to help guide Greensboro into a new era where all are loved, all are respected, and the dignity and the worth of all of God's children is affirmed. That's the way to grow the change that we need.
When was the last time you got emotional thinking about the shooting?
This morning.
A few hours ago. We were sharing our story with some clergy here in town, fellow clergy, that's with him, and looking at some of the footage. Might have been some of the footage from your TV station, I don't know, because 4 or 5 TV stations were there along with the print media that day. And just seeing beautiful friends lying on the ground dead or dying. Seeing my husband who stood up out of hurt and just rage at what had happened, declare that this could not have happened without the involvement of the police, because he knew we had sought and had a legal parade permit and all that, though the police weren't there. And then he got told to shut up and refused to shut up, and was wrestled to the ground, arrested, put in jail. So that night I had no idea whether I'd ever see him alive again. And so it brings back that pain. But part of what I've learned to do, and part of what that song is about, is that I use that pain, which I think I've heard that recently, the pain deepen the purpose and just the persistence of pushing for that beloved community as opposed to just wallowing in it. So I've learned to give way to the tears, but say they're watering some potential flowers of, social, humanity type flowers that will grow that I might not ever see personally, but that the pain, the tears I shed will end up helping all of us as humankind. But you do still feel the hurt, just like anybody else that you lose. I've today been just thinking about the loss of Elijah Cummings, just different folk who've played roles along the way. And know that other people are going to have to step up to the plate.
Was it ever possible for you, or were you ever even interested in forgiving the people on the other side?
Oh, yeah. A big piece of the truth process had the forgiveness element in it, but it had to be forgiveness based on truth. And so there have been conversations. My husband personally has had some conversations with Klan and Nazi members that had that element of the forgiveness in it, and they expressed some shame, perhaps not to the fullest level, but you learn to receive people where they are. But absolutely, and what I do day to day is really not fueled by hate. That would probably eat me up. There's, we have a family and we have friends, and as I said, we have just other people, some of whom we don't even know, that we know that we are working for. So yeah, forgiveness is a part of it, but it's based on the truth. So it's not an empty kind of forgiveness, but more depthful and, as a Christian, part of what I remember, one of the quotes from Jesus, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. But it's not like Jesus was not a very exacting, clear person speaking to the powers and principalities of that day, which their great-great-great-grandchildren are alive today, still being some of the powers and principalities of oppression.
I think forgiveness is pretty much misunderstood in our culture. When Jesus said, forgive them because they don't know what they do, the supposition behind that is that if you want the best for them, that would be them knowing what they do and then changing, because the best for them is the best for you, and the best for me is the best for them. That we need to be in authentic relationship that affirms our humanity. And actually the constant pitting people against each other, which is kind of part of the way of being in our culture, cannot lead to the beloved community. It leads to cycles of over and against. In 1987, I heard that the Klan planned to march on Greensboro. This would have been 6-7 years after I was in seminary, and I made the decision to go visit the Grand Dragon. I called him, and actually I found out where he lived. I drove to his house. I didn't want to announce myself because I just wanted to walk in and have a conversation. But he wasn't there, so I left a note under the door which quoted Matthew 5:43, which says, love your enemy and pray for those who despitefully use you. And I came back home and I called and I got him and I told him I had been to his house. He started cursing and said, you haven't been to my GD house. I said, I've been to your house. Carol, his name is Carol Crawford. And I said, go to your back door and look under it. He lived in a mobile home, and call me back. And he did, and he called me back, and he started cursing all over again. You have been to my GD house. I said, yeah, and I want to talk to you, man. This is not a game with me. Y'all don't need to come back to Greensboro and spit on the graves of the people. And he said, I'm not coming to Greensboro and walk into a trap. I said, I will come to you wherever you are, and we agree on a time and place to meet you. And we did. And I went and I met him. We had a 3-hour conversation. Virgil Griffin, the ex-Grand Dragon, and Carol Crawford, the current Grand Dragon. I don't want to go into that long conversation, but the long and short of it was they started talking. I asked, why are you coming back? They said, because y'all raped our women. I said, be serious with me, man. You think that the rainbow of colors in the black race grew from slaves raping white women? You know what Master did. You know what these people did in these huts late at night. And now you throw this back in my face? He backed off a little bit, and then he said, y'all taking our jobs. I said, what black man owns a textile mill in North Carolina, you know? I told him, this is, you're just terribly misled. And I'm just saying to you, don't come back to Greensboro with your guns, because you just excite people responding. He slowed down a little bit and conceded that I had a point. And he said, but we got to come, because if we told the other Klan members that we talked to a black man, that he used the N-word, that we would probably be put out of the Klan. And we'd listen to him. So he said, we're coming, we're going to bring our guns, but we're not going to start anything. And they did. Later on, Reverend Harrison, my pastor, and the only person in Greensboro living now, Father Morales, we met with them again at a hotel here to discuss the need for them to change and all of that. My classmate Jim Green and Bob Gibson met with us as well. I was in seminary. I've shared this story 4 or 5 times. None of it ever showed up in print. None of it ever was broadcast. People wanted to freeze an image of us as some kind of eternal combatants with the Klan and Nazis. That's simply not true. When we put out the truth process, I went over and greeted, not just the older ones, but they brought young men with their hair cut down to nothing, and I talked to them and welcomed them into Greensboro. So we've tried to do what we can. I don't wear the labels and the images that people ascribe to me, but I don't also capitulate into some false hugging contest, you know. We've got to face the truth. There is a system problem that creates individual problems.